If you're a fan of the Rolex Submariner, but for some reason aren't willing to spend $10,000 or be put on a waitlist for 5 years, you could easily head over to AliExpress and find a watch that is a copy of it or an homage to it for around $100. And surprisingly, at that price, there's a lot of decent options there. But what if you wanted something that was much closer to Rolex's level of excellence? What if somehow you were willing to spend $1,700 on a good Rolex Submariner Alternative? That sounds like a crazy proposition, but that's exactly what the watch that we're looking at today does. And if you look at reviews of this watch online, you're going to find a lot of extremely positive, glowing reviews in terms of the level of quality that they've been able to accomplish at that $1,700 price. But if you dig deeper, you're also going to find a lot of controversy and rumors swirling around the brand behind it. And all of that makes this one of the most interesting watches that I've gotten a chance to review. We're going to jump into all that in just a minute, but first take a quick look at the Ginault Silent Service. Hey guys, welcome back to Just the Watch. My name's Dave. I live in Japan and I love to collect affordable watches. And once again today, I have a brand that was willing to send in a watch that is not so affordable, which has been great for me because it gives me a chance to check out some of these more expensive watches to get more of a feel of what this segment of the market is like. And hopefully that's also useful to people who are considering spending a little bit outside of the affordable price range if they're looking to see what they're going to be able to get in terms of quality. The watch that we're looking at today comes from a brand that is not only based in the United States, but even on the dial of their watches, they make the proud claim that the watch is hand-built in America. Not made in the USA, but hand-built in America. And that right there is probably going to set some people off because this made in America or hand-built in the USA, this kind of language when it comes to describing products in marketing is a very controversial and even touches on a lot of legal issues. Now, the bulk of this review is going to focus on the watch and the level of quality that goes into it because it is phenomenal in that regards. But Ginault made some pretty big waves in the watch community a few years back. There were wild speculations and rumors about the brand that has kind of turned some people off to them. And so we will get into all of that at the end of this video. But before we do, I want to start by focusing on the watch. Because if the watch isn't that good, then the controversy doesn't really matter that much anyways. But maybe that's the problem because the watch itself is actually very good. Before we go further, I do need to mention that this watch was sent in for free by Ginault, which is why you saw the paid promotions flag at the beginning of this video. However, other than the watch itself, I did not receive any additional compensation, nor did Ginault have any control over the content of this review. So with that out of the way, let's get into who Ginault is and what makes them interesting or desirable as a micro brand. And I think there are three primary things that characterize Ginault as a brand. The first being that they are clearly and unashamedly influenced by Rolex designs. This is a brand that is owned by Rolex enthusiasts, and in a lot of ways it is made for Rolex enthusiasts. All of the watches that Ginault has made clearly start with Rolex as the inspiration. In the case of the Ocean Rover, they didn't stray too far from that formula, and that one really is, in a lot of ways, an homage to the Rolex Mil Sub. And in the case of the Silent Service, which we're looking at today, even though it strays much further from the Rolex formula, it still began with the idea of creating a watch based around the Rolex Submariner Maxi or Super case. But then from that original idea, they went in a lot of different and interesting directions that make this watch a lot different from anything that Rolex has ever put out. And so really the ones who are going to get the most out of these watches are people who are very into the Rolex Submariner, who know all of the details and history, and maybe people who have had certain pet peeves about Rolex designs and always had a wish list of how they wish Rolex would do things a little bit differently. Because I think that's what Ginault is trying to cater to here. It's like they're trying to produce watches that the Rolex fans want, but for some reason Rolex themselves don't seem to want to make. The second thing that really characterizes this brand is that they are owned and operated by a very small team. Primarily, it's just two people that handle everything. They have a watchmaker and a machinist, and so all of the watches are made in small batches. They're primarily made to order, which is why there's often a bit of a lead time. And I think that shows through in the final product. This is not something that's mass-produced in a big factory, and Ginault has a ton of control over every aspect of the watch. The third thing that I think characterizes this brand is also one of the things that has gotten them in trouble a bit in the past, and that is their commitment to trying to make as much of the watch as possible in the United States. As an American watch enthusiast, I love to see brands doing this. I feel like in the past, America had a great history in watchmaking that has sort of been lost. And I think Ginault is doing a pretty admirable job in producing a lot more of the watch in the United States than I actually expected. Now, in the past, they have faced some criticism about not being transparent about which parts of the watch are made in America and which parts are made overseas. And I think even today, some people are still going to have a problem with the hand-built in America that's printed on the dial. However, they were very open with me about their manufacturing process and where they're sourcing their parts from. Obviously, this has a Swiss movement inside, so they're sourcing that from Switzerland. But they noted that the mid-case, the case backs, the crown, and the bezel assemblies are CNC'd and contracted at their machine shops domestically in the United States. They handcraft their own dials in America. But then other parts, such as the gaskets, the O-rings, the bracelets, the crystals, and the bezel inserts are sourced from suppliers in Asia. And then in the US, they assemble the watches, they do the quality control, and they regulate the movements themselves. So at this point, I don't think they're really hiding at all what they mean by hand-built in America. I think they are being very transparent there. And I really applaud their efforts in trying to push the envelope in terms of what can be built in America and still keep costs relatively low. And all of this does result in a very high-quality final product. This is one of the best built, best finished, and best looking watches that I've seen. Next, let's turn our attention specifically to the Silent Service, to this specific watch. We'll talk about the design, the feel, the quality, and wrap it up by evaluating the value that's on offer here. And when we talk about design, we need to start by looking at it from a comparison of Rolex and the Submariner, because that is very clearly a heavy influence on every aspect of this watch. And in fact, I think that Rolex's influence even goes beyond just the design of this watch. I feel like they're really trying to aspire to Rolex's level of quality, the level of accuracy in their movements, and in offering the same functionality that Rolex offers, particularly in their bracelets and clasp, so that in almost any way that you compare this to a watch from Rolex, it's going to come out pretty favorably, especially for the cost. And while I don't think they're able to exactly match Rolex in terms of quality, they're pricing this at about 1/5 of the retail price of a Rolex Submariner, and they'll start making it for you as soon as you place your order. And at that price, they don't have to match Rolex. If they come close, then that's going to be a pretty desirable thing for most people. For the design of the Silent Service, I think Ginault had two main things that they were trying to accomplish. The first was to produce their version of a watch based around the Rolex Maxi case or Super case that was released in 2010. On watches such as the Submariner 116610, when Rolex updated the cases on the Submariner to create this bulkier, more masculine look, which was most noticeable in the thicker, more blocky lugs. And this update by Rolex was pretty well received, but it was also a little bit controversial, and Ginault felt like the proportions could be improved upon a little bit. The first generation of the Rolex Submariners with the Super case featured a 40mm case diameter and 20mm lug openings. Rolex changed this again in 2020 when they updated the Submariner to have a 41mm case with a 21mm lug opening, which both gave the watch a larger appearance and also made for a smoother transition from those kind of blocky lugs into the bracelet. With the Silent Service, Ginault has tried to maintain that smooth transition between the case and the bracelet while using a 41mm case size and 20mm lug opening. And I think this worked really well. The silhouette on the Silent Service is great. It definitely calls to mind the Rolex Super case and the Maxi case. I like the slightly larger 41mm diameter, but I also really appreciate that they managed to keep a standard 20mm lug opening, which will really open this up to a lot of strap options, as 20mm straps are a lot easier to source than 21mm. But one thing to keep in mind if you are planning on swapping this over to different straps is that you'll likely need one of those tweezer-style spring bar removal tools rather than the standard stick style. And that's because the tolerances between the end links and the lug openings are incredibly tight. And I mean this in a good way. They are perfectly matched to each other with no gap whatsoever, which makes for a very confident and seamless connection between the watch and the bracelet. Going back to the case of the watch, Ginault did take some pretty sharp deviations from Rolex. Most notably, there are no crown guards on this case, and the crown is an oversized crown. And that highlights what I think was Ginault's second main goal in creating this watch, and that was to create something that is truly distinct from the Submariner. The bezel insert, the hands, the dial markers, the oversized unguarded crown. These are all areas where Ginault took clear, deliberate efforts to distinguish this watch from a Rolex Submariner homage. And as someone who's not a fan of those one-to-one copy homages, I really like the way they've gone with this watch. I'm never going to have the money to be able to buy an actual Rolex, and I'm kind of turned off by those one-to-one copy homages, so that I probably would never buy one of those cheap, affordable ones. And in that sense, the design philosophy here is one that really appeals to me. Rather than having a coin edge grip, the grip on the bezel has much wider teeth and openings, reminding me more of crenellations on a castle tower. This gives the watch an even tougher look, and it also is extremely easy to grip when you're operating the bezel action. You can get it with a bi-directional 12-click dual-time bezel, or you can go for a more common and classic 120-click unidirectional dive-time bezel, which is what I have here. And the bezel action on this watch feels amazing. It is unlike the bezel action on any other watch that I've ever tested, and it's so satisfying to use. It has such a silky smooth action to it. The resistance is exactly the right amount, and while you can audibly hear each click very clearly defined, you almost can't feel any of that thudding on your fingertips as you actuate the bezel. It is the most premium and luxurious bezel action that I've ever felt. The bezel insert is a fully lumed sapphire insert, which is another deviation from Rolex's ceramic bezel inserts, while still going with a choice that is commonly seen in luxury watches. Another big highlight for me is the dial and handset on this watch. I have never been a big fan of Rolex's Mercedes style hands. I could tolerate them on a watch that's actually from Rolex, but I hate to see them on any other brand, and that's one of the biggest things that keeps me away from Rolex homage watches typically. So I think these classic sword-shaped hands here are a perfect choice for the watch, and they are extremely high-quality diamond-cut hands that are excellently finished and polished. The same can also be said for each of the applied indexes, which have been riveted to the dial by hand. All of these elements are finished with a high polish that contrasts beautifully against this matte black dial. The dial texture seems very simple, but it doesn't look cheap at all. There's a very subtle texture to it that kind of just soaks up the light, which really allows those polished elements on the hands and markers to shine and catch the light in beautiful ways. And the stark white BGW9 lume offers incredibly high contrast against that matte dial. Just as Ginault offers multiple customization options when it comes to the bezel, they do the same with the date as well. I chose to get the version with the date and that Cyclops style magnifier, but they also offer it without the magnifier or without the date altogether. And they can offer all of these customization options because they build each watch to order. Let's go ahead and turn the lights off and see how this watch looks in the dark. They went with a BGW9 lume formulation, which gives a bright blue glow in the dark, very similar to Rolex's Chromalight. And when it comes to lume, the longevity and the performance is going to be very comparable to what Rolex offers. But in this case, you're getting a fully lume bezel, which for those of you who are obsessed with lume will likely be a point in favor of the Ginault over the Submariner's simple lume pip at 12 o'clock. Running this through my J-score test, it came out with a very admirable result of 13, which isn't crazy, but it's putting it on the upper end of what you typically see in dive watches these days. All right, lights back on. Let's take one more close look at the dial. I want to point out something that kind of gave me a little bit of a chuckle when I saw it, and that is how Ginault tried so hard to match Rolex line for line when it comes to the text that is printed on this dial. So starting at 12 o'clock, you have the Ginault logo, and underneath you have Ginault written in text, and then in small type underneath that you have kinetic continuous date. Compare that to the Submariner, which has the exact same logo and text layout, but theirs says Oyster Perpetual date. Now, Oyster Perpetual is just a marketing term that Rolex themselves came up with, so Ginault matched that with kinetic continuous, a term that they seem to have coined for themselves, in both cases getting across the idea that this has an automatic mechanical movement inside of it. Dropping down to the 6 o'clock segment of the dial, you have 4 lines of text. In red, you have the model name, which is the Silent Service. Underneath that, you've got the depth rating at 1,000 feet / 300 meters. Then beneath that, it says Submersible Maritime, and then finally Precision Chronometer on the final line. Compare that to the Submariner, which also has 4 lines of text. The first being the model name, the Submariner, followed by 1,000 feet / 300 meters. Rolex boasts that theirs is a superlative chronometer and that it is officially certified. So both Ginault and Rolex took some time to boast about the accuracy of their movement on the dial of the watch, which we'll get into in just a second. But this wordy, text-heavy dial is something that is characteristic of the Submariner. And Ginault, being the Submariner fans that they are, really liked that balance of text on the dial and sought to mimic it as much as possible, often by kind of making up their own words to put on there. But in both cases, they are not meaningless. Ginault boasts that this is a precision chronometer, which is not an official term. They're really just saying that the movement is very accurate. And this is a claim that they really back up. The movement in this watch is a Swiss Sellita SW200-1 Elaboré grade, which is the most accurate grade that Sellita offers for the SW200. And while the accuracy of the watch itself isn't independently certified, Ginault puts each one of their movements through their own in-house 6-week-long testing and regulation process. The goal is to get the mean daily rate of the movement as close to zero as possible. And they give you this cool little certificate that shows all of the measurements that they took over the course of that 6-week process. In the case of this particular watch, the movement was averaging plus 6 seconds per day out of the factory from Sellita. And over the course of the 6 weeks of testing and regulation in each of those 5 positions, they were able to get it down to plus 3.8 seconds per day, which is a pretty significant improvement. It actually gets it down within the range that COSC requires when they do their independent certification. Again, this watch is not COSC certified, but Ginault was able to get the movement performing pretty much as if it were. Final thing I want to highlight here is the bracelet and clasp on this watch. Now again, this is a budget watch channel, so I don't have a lot of experience with luxury watches. That said, I can confidently say that the bracelet and clasp on this watch are the best I've ever reviewed. Like the rest of the watch, the bracelet is excellently finished, and it features a very steep taper going from 20 millimeters at the lugs all the way down to 15 at the clasp. I found this to be both a very elegant and distinct look, and also to be very comfortable on the wrist. And the clasp is another area where they're basically trying to match Rolex in terms of functionality and quality, and I think they've done a pretty amazing job here. That flip-up locking mechanism on the clasp is so satisfying and fun to use. It's almost its own fidget toy in addition to the bezel action. And the same can be said for the amazing tool-free micro adjustment that's built into that clasp. Simply pop the back end of the bracelet up and you can smoothly adjust its length as needed and then snap it back down to lock it into place. There is such a high feeling of quality when it comes to the smoothness of all of these mechanisms, the bezel action, the clasp, the micro adjustment on that clasp, as well as the threading on the crown. All of those things are dialed in perfectly and are truly premium in their execution. All right, let's try and wrap all of this up and talk about value. Depending on the options that you select, this watch is going to cost somewhere between $1,500 and $1,800 US. For that money, you're competing with brands like Oris and higher tier micro brands like Monta. And in terms of the quality of the watch, the accuracy of the movement, the level of finishing, this is going to compete very well against other watches in this price range. But I think the chief draw of this watch is to people who are fans of the Rolex Submariner. They're the ones who are really going to appreciate all of the details here. There's a lot of little nods and winks to the Submariner built into the design of this watch. The level of quality on offer here is phenomenal. The price is 1/5 of the retail price of the Submariner, and you can go on their website, place an order, they'll make a watch for you, and it'll be ready in about 8 weeks. So it's much easier to get your hands on this watch than the Submariner. So I think where this watch makes its strongest value proposition is in appealing to people who are big fans of the Rolex Submariner. They want something that is a very high quality watch, something that looks and reminds them of the Submariner, but they want something that's more affordable and more available. Then this is a very attractive watch. And me personally, I really like this watch. Again, as someone who usually only wears affordable watches, I can definitely feel the pretty large step up in quality with this watch. And as a watch enthusiast, I have a lot of respect for the Rolex Submariner, so I have really enjoyed wearing this watch around. But if you're not a big fan of the Rolex Submariner, this is going to be a much tougher sell. There's a lot of high quality watches in this price range from more established, more recognized brands that also offer very distinct and unique designs that may be more suitable to your tastes and personality. So now that we've seen the level of quality and value that's on offer here from Ginault, we need to switch and talk about the controversies surrounding the brand. Because for some, it may play a role in your decision on whether or not to purchase this watch. For me personally, the controversies and rumors surrounding this brand almost add to the level of intrigue and interest in it. One way that you could sum up all of these controversies is that the watch is so good for the price that there has to be some kind of catch, which in some ways is a little bit refreshing almost, because oftentimes the controversies around watches are that they're overpricing them and they're just cheap watches that are being overmarketed and people are charging an exorbitant amount of money. That's not the case at all here. It's the complete opposite. And there's been two main controversies that have been swirling around. A few years back, somebody wrote an unsubstantiated blog post accusing the owner of Ginault of being a notorious Rolex counterfeiter who had essentially gone legit and started his own brand. The implication was that the reason these watches were able to be such a high quality and so close to Rolex is because the owner had spent a lot of years counterfeiting Rolex watches. Now, the owners of Ginault have strongly denied this, and as far as I'm concerned, this isn't anything more than an unsubstantiated rumor at this point. But if you search for Ginault online, it's definitely going to come up. The second controversy is related to the claim of Ginault watches being made in America or hand-built in the USA. I believe in some of their early watches, they did make the mistake of putting made in the USA on the dials or on the back of their watch, which is a very heavily regulated term in the United States. To put that on a product basically means that every substantial part of the product was produced domestically in the United States and built in the United States. And again, early on, people saw the level of quality and the price that they're offering here, and they thought there's absolutely no way that you could make a made in the USA watch for that price. This one, I think, has been completely cleared up because Ginault themselves no longer uses that specific term. They've switched to hand-built in the USA. And at least in my contact with them, they were very clear about which aspects of the watch were produced domestically in the United States and which parts they imported. So while I'm sure a lot of people are still going to have a lot of questions and arguments about this, but I would love to hear what you have to say about it down below in the comments. This wound up being a much longer video than I expected, but again, it's such an interesting watch, an interesting brand. I felt like I had a lot to say about it. So please let me know what you think. That's going to wrap it up for today. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.